Hello, good evening. God bless you. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Neverland. We are the Lost Boys, and we're just enjoying. Oh, God. Okay. It's supposed to be serious, right? Sorry. No, I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. Welcome to Neverland. We're the Lost Boys. We're the four horsemen of the revealing of the apocalypse. We're whatever you want to call us. We're all of the above. We love you, and we are excited to be talking to you. We're just a bunch of goofballs.
It's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse because we are swimming in a river of joy, and we've been submerged and baptized in a new way of thinking. We are excited to be with you, and we are excited that you are with us. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are listening, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you catch us. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And also, if you feel the urge and you want to have somebody wrap their arms around you, come be here. We're at 1508 Hargrove Avenue in Gastonia, North Carolina. We usually start up about 10 a.m. on Sundays. And if you want any of us or all of us to wrap our arms around you and love you, please come and be a part of us and join us in what we're doing here. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'd like to say a quick prayer. I'm just in such a good mood. It's just been, and it's followed up from the same idea of thinking of things that we've said in the past, of joy and contradiction, and having a week of different ups and downs of contradictions of whatever it is. It doesn't really matter what you're facing, what I've faced, or anybody. It's finding the joy and being able to dance and sing and be joyful in the middle of contradiction, knowing that Jesus, he was the apokatastasis, is the Greek word. It's used one time in the Bible. It's used one time in Scripture. No, Luke said it. Acts 3:21, where it's about the restoration of all things. That he was the apokatastasis. It's mentioned one time in the Bible, but you have all of these early church fathers that they wrote and wrote and wrote about it because they believed something that Jesus did, that what Jesus did was for everybody. So, man, Lord, you are the source of our existence. We recognize your beauty. We thank you for your joy that is in our hearts, and we thank you for the love that is exuding out of us because we recognize what the Scripture has said, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, and then you turn around and give us the ministry of reconciliation so that we can make sure that everybody knows that they were included in the work of Christ, that there was nothing more for Jesus to do. Now all that there is left to do is to live in the life of love that you have provided for us. Thank you, Lord, for your Spirit that is always with us. Thank you for your presence and your parousia, not a presence that is of something that is to come eventually, of some dispensationalist idea, but your presence is with us everywhere we go because you live in our hearts by faith. Thank you, Jesus, for everything that you are doing with us tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. So Michael preached Sunday, and wow, that guy, the one with the tall one over here, that I was told that he cast a shadow on me, so I have to scoot forward. And so this tall guy doesn't cast a shadow. But he preached Sunday, and he talked about the kid, it's called the kid giant. Yeah. Right? All right. And that's what was... It had so many different symbols and so many different revelations that were unlocking as he was talking and going through all of that. But something that continued to resonate within me was I kept thinking, even towards the end of it and just the rest of this week, and that's why I wanted to start out by saying, welcome to Neverland. Welcome to the Lost Boys. Welcome to being here. And I think that maybe that ties in a little bit too, because we will have this Sunday, Josh will preach. We will also have a baptism where some of our younger 11, 12-year-old kids, they want to be baptized. So if you want to get in the water, come and get in the water with us on Sunday. Bring your swimmies, and we'll splash around with you. Watch Hook before you get baptized. We've all watched it, and I'm probably going to watch it again before Sunday comes around. I'm just being honest with you. He said, oh, yeah. So I kept thinking that. when you were preaching that it's welcome to Neverland, welcome to being this David character who is 15 years old or less.
Yeah.
More than likely less than 15 years old.
Yeah.
Who already has the story to tell that he'd killed a bear, that he had killed a lion, and that this giant is nothing to him. And here he is believing in the absolute impossible.
Right.
And then AJ calls me Monday, and then the very next day on Tuesday, because we referenced that passage in Matthew 19 where it says, with man or anthropos, this is impossible.
Yes.
It means it cannot be done. You do not have the ability. With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible.
Yes.
So it directs you immediately to the idea in Matthew 13 where he says that the kingdom of heaven is like a seed or like a grain of a mustard seed that a man plants into a field, that it might be one of the smallest of all. The word is micros. It's one of the smallest or least is what it really means. The least of seeds, but grows into one of the greatest herbs and can even become a tree where birds reside.
Yep.
So this young faith, this youthfulness, and here he is being able to already have the story that he's killed a bear and a lion, that the giant is nothing to him. And then what do we do with the anthropos? What does the anthropos begin to do? It begins to place on him all of the armor.
Yep.
This is the way you're supposed to do it, David.
Yep.
You got to do it like us. Remember, we have our. This is the way we structure our services, and this is the way that we live our life. This is what we call orthodox, and you have to do this. And if you don't wear the right cassock or you don't have the right things that you do, whatever, and we try to put that on David, and it's the same thing with us that what we do within Christianity. We try to fit Christianity or try to fit everything that God is doing into these bookends that we call the Bible. And we put God in the middle of these two bookends, because this is not just one book. These are multiple books compiled together. And we say, God, this is all that you've ever done, and this is all you ever will do. And David, this is it. That's all you got to do right there. If you anything that's happened, it's going to happen between here. And we try to limit the possibilities of God within that. But here's a boy, not a grown man. Here's a boy living in the freedom of who he is, who's already by his own hands killed a bear, killed a lion, and he says that this giant is nothing to him. And I kept, man, I don't even know if I want to go to this part next or if I want to read this next section, because as you got to the end of it, it was apparent to me that I was gonna have to read this poem that my daughter wrote during service on Sunday. Josh wasn't here. That's right. Crap, I forgot. You haven't even heard this story yet. All right. So we were singing a song on Sunday, and it was Graves in the Gardens, an elevation song. And it gets to this bridge where it says that you're the only one who can. We say it over and over. You're the only one who can. You turn graves in the gardens. You're the only one that can. Well, I think that may have been the second song we sang, maybe. And my 11-year-old daughter, Hadley, who is very artistic and creative and loves doing things like that, she is sitting in the audience and listens to us play that song. Here's her dad up there playing. All of us are up here singing this song. And I guess what got me was the confidence that she wrote this with. And waits till service is over, because almost after every worship service, she almost always gives me a little note. And I keep a lot of them here, and I use them as bookmarks. But she usually steals one of the tithe envelopes in the back or the visitor cards and writes a note on there. So that's where a lot of them go, is to Hadley or to me, because Hadley writes in them and writes a note that just says, "I love you, Dad." She's done that for I don't know how long. She's done it for years now, or really as long as she could write, I guess. But so that's where all, if you're wondering where all the tithe envelopes are going, they're right here, and they're used as bookmarks. But this time she asked my mom for a piece of paper, and she starts writing this down, and this is her poem or song or verse, whatever it is that you want to call it, that changes this song around a little bit. And for her, this is what she says, and she even wrote a title at the top where it was "Grow Palm Trees," which I don't even know. Well, I asked her. I said, "Why did you?" Well, I'll tell you that later. Never mind. Man, getting ahead of myself. I'm excited, as if you can't tell. I've had no caffeine this afternoon either. I'm just living on the bread of life and the wine that comes from the sweet revelation of Jesus. As water is poured into me and it's pouring out as revelation. How do you like that? She says this in response to the song, no, he is not the only one who can. We can also plant the seed and the tree grows into a garden. And we cannot, goodness, help me, Jesus. Yes. So we cannot turn ashes, but we can see beauty in the ashes. And then she writes it again. She says, no, he is not the only one who can do it. We can plant the seed in the ground and love it, and it will grow into a healthy palm tree, and nothing will knock over the palm tree. And we can't turn beauty, or we can't turn ashes back into beauty, but we can see the beauty in the ashes. And I guess part of it too was the confidence that she said it with, is no, affirmatively, no, he is not the only one who can. And I walked to the back, to the hallway, to where the classes are, and that's where she handed it to me, and I'm reading it. And the very first thing I do is I panic. I'm like, oh my God, I've created a little polytheist, and she's about to start explaining to me because she knows some of these stories, and I've used so many of them in talking to her. And now it's like, now I've got this kid that's just going to worship every God in the world. And like, it's like, with everything that I teach, it always comes back to Jesus, because that's what I believe. But with her, I thought, oh Lord, what have I done? But then she recognizes it within herself. That's what she is saying, that if I've listened to anything that my dad has taught, and she does this is right before Michael begins to preach, and then Michael gets up and starts talking about this 15-year-old kid that's already killed a lion, that's already killed a bear, and says this giant is nothing to me. And it made me think that if that 11-year-old or 12-year-old or 15-year-old boy can do that, here's my daughter hearing the voice of God herself, and says that God puts it within us to plant the seeds. And if you have a place in your life that is turned into a place of death, you can turn it yourself back into a garden. And so I asked her the next day, we were talking about it, and I said, well, what made you pick a palm tree when you were writing this down? And she said, well, I just remembered the story that you had told me about the girl whose name means palm tree. And she, we didn't go into all the gory details about Tamar because she's a little young for that, but told her some of the story of Tamar a while back, and she remembered Tamar is a girl whose name means palm tree, who has a son whose name is Pharez, which means the breaker. And then we read Psalm, I think it was 92, where it says the righteous shall flourish, which literally means to break forth out of the ground like a palm tree. And so here she is taking these symbols and these ideas and saying that if you're going to build a garden, this is the garden that Hadley would build. It's going to be a garden of palm trees that every time a storm comes, we're not talking about little dainty little flowers that are going to rip out of the ground every time the wind blows. If you're going to plant a garden, God has given you a seed, and God has given you a seed to plant into your graveyard. And in that graveyard, plant some palm trees that when the storms come, it's not going to knock it over. It might bend it down to the ground, but it'll stand up even taller and stronger every time it goes through a storm. And the other thing that she was doing is that we were reading Psalm 23 this past week and talking about where that section where it says that you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and he doesn't pluck you out of the valley of the shadow of death. It doesn't remove you from the death. You walk with him through it, and he walks with you through your own death, through whatever that graveyard is in your life. Listen to the voice of my daughter who's preaching to us tonight. Walk straight through the graveyard, and while you're there, plant some seeds and turn it back into a garden of palm trees. Turn it into an oasis by the Spirit and the faith that lives within you. And it's not that we're doing faith as something that is almost like this work ethic that you have to make it happen. You have to make God's hand move by your faith. Lynn had sent me a video this week of a brother who's preaching in South Africa, and he begins to talk. Man, it was beautiful. So beautiful. And he starts talking about the opposite of faith. And I've said for so long, I think that the opposite of faith is sight, because the Bible says that we walk by faith and not by sight. And so he says something very similar. He said the opposite of faith is certainty, of knowing. So we walk by faith, not by our certainty. We walk by faith, not by our sight, not by what we see, not by what is the apparent, but what is the real. So there's an idea in that in Platonism. And I disagree with it. I think Nietzsche disagreed with it too. I'm almost finished. I'm going to give this back over to you. This goes hand in glove with what you were saying. When you take the idea from Platonism, he talks about the apparent and the real. The apparent world is the world that we live in right now. It's the world that we see. It's the world that we feel. It's the world that we touch. It's everything that we experience by our senses. And then he talks about the real world. The real world is something that we cannot see, something that is yet to be seen, something that is far off and in a distant land that is beyond the apparent. Well, what does Christianity do other than take that idea and say that the apparent world is something that God does away with, rips it out of your hands, or it goes and it burns into fire, and the apparent world, it means nothing. What you really want is the home beyond the sky. It's heaven. It's the real world. That's what really matters. But by the way, what you do in the apparent world matters. So if you do the wrong thing, you won't make it into the real world. So Nietzsche takes this idea after living in a time in the mid to late 1800s, after the rapture ideas began to be promulgated in the early 1800s, it's made its way to him now. And I think that that's what inspires him to write Thus Spake Zarathustra, as he begins to write these parables about God, that manhood, or being a man, is something to be surpassed. And he uses that phraseology, that man is supposed to be surpassed, saying not the idea where he had an anti-Semitic sister named Elizabeth that began to edit his writings, and then Hitler begins to take these writings, and eventually they become the idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman, of this. Now you've got this idea of this macho character who can do whatever he wants with his own will. He can be Goliath, and that's the idea that I was thinking on Sunday when you were preaching, that's the wrong idea. Taking the ideas from Nietzsche about the Übermensch, you end up with someone that's a Goliath. You end up with someone who's a bully. You end up with someone that has unbridled violence and can do whatever he wants to whomever he wants. And that's what Goliath represents. He stands in the face of everything that these people believe, the ideas in Judaism, and mocks it. The ideas in Judaism is that they take what they believe, and he's mocking their God. He's mocking their very core of who they are, because it was God that took them out of Egyptian bondage. It is God that placed them in the land. It is God that had them inherit the land. It is God that is with them today. And here's this giant that stands head and shoulders above them all. The ideal Übermensch in Hitler's world is that he's this strong character and this loud, boisterous being. And then here comes the real one who's grown beyond, or the manhood that's been surpassed. And the way that Nietzsche begins to talk about manhood being surpassed is not the idea of being this super strong man that can lift 1,000 men, or has the strength of 1,000 men, but someone who has the strength, a man that has the strength to dance in the street joyfully, to be made a fool of, to someone who can be foolish and be joyful and be happy, which makes me think yet again of what we talked about in James, that in the middle of contradiction, you can have joy. And it takes us right back to the idea of David, who did not stop at 15 years old of being this childlike man, but when the presence of the Lord begins to make its way back to the city of David, makes its way back to the city of Jerusalem, and he sees that the ark of God's covenant, everything that God has promised to his people, the symbol of that promise, is making its way back into the city. He goes outside and he dances like a little boy. He's excited. He's joyful. He's happy. And his wife yells out the window. And what does she say? You look like a fool. Yeah. He does not care that he looks like a fool. He's excited because the presence and the parousia of God is within him. And it's dwelling within him by faith. And this faith works by love. Man, I'll stop. I'll let you.
That's good, man. It's all good. And I started Sunday talking about the mustard seed of faith. Mm-hmm. because it came up twice before we ever even started, and or before I got started talking, anyways. And then here Hadley's already had that revelation. So let it be established in the mouth of two or three. But you talked about Psalm 23, and I think you mentioned it Sunday as well. That David wrote the psalm as a shepherd. Knowing that he's learned all these things from his father, who is the good shepherd. And I can't help but think that maybe, and I'm sure there were probably a lot of different things that were going through his mind when he talked about the valley of the shadow of death, but it was in the valley of Elah that he faced Goliath. It was there in that valley. So from Sunday, a couple of things I wanted to run back through, but one of the things was the juxtaposition between David and Goliath, their names and what they mean. And David means beloved. And I looked this up, and I had actually forgotten to include this, but like I said, Sunday, the Hebrew language is built around symbols, but each symbol has a pictograph, which is literally just like a drawn picture of what the symbol represents. And it's neat. It's really cool if you have some time. If you're interested in language, it's a really, really cool thing to study, to go and look at the symbols and then look at the pictures and see how they kind of line up. But the word for beloved in the Hebrew actually means passion, and it's represented by these two little, they look like a half of a T, but the pictograph is a straight line with a little box underneath it, and it represents the temple door. But when you put two of those together, that's where you get the word passion, and it represents, or it represents the breast, right? So the use of this letter twice indicates two danglers representing a woman's breasts. The part of the female body invoking heat of passion and love. I told you it was going to get worse.
You didn't say danglers.
I said it. Udder, that's another one.
Peter Dinklage.
The teat, or which is, again, it's representative of a double exchange of the T and the D. But that's where that comes from. It's this idea of one that is being drawn close, right? Because what does a mother do with a baby? She breastfeeds it, right? And so that's what's happening with, or that is who David is, right? The beloved, right? He's the beloved of the Lord. He's the one that's close to the Father's breast. And Goliath, his name actually means exile. And so, like, if you just look at the name Goliath or Goliath, which is, I kind of went through that Sunday as to, we don't really say it right because it got lost in translation, right? Like, I mean, it goes through, a couple iterations of Hebrew and Aramaic or whatever, and then it gets flipped into the Greek, and then it gets flipped into, Latin and English, and we're trying to say Goliath, and that's how you're supposed to say it. And you have to say it exactly like that. But it's Goliath and not Goliath. But that means exile, which it comes from the word galah, and that is to experience the yoke. That's literally what it means when you translate the actual pictograph. So when you translate the picture words, and it's the eye, which is knowledge, and it's the shepherd's crook. That's the other picture. But that represents the yoke. It does represent the shepherd's crook, but it also represents the yoke. So something that's, tied around your neck, something that's got you weighed down, something that's got you. But anyways, it's to experience, the yoke or experience the work, right? And then it directly translates as the word work. But the difference between Goliath and David is they are totally, completely polar opposites. David is the one who is closest to the Father. He is the beloved. He's the one that's near to the Father's breast. And then Goliath's the exile. That's the part that God really doesn't want to have anything to do with. It's like we've heard it quoted many different times and totally misunderstood, but God hates the legs of a man. You know, the legs of a man. Why? Because he doesn't want you to stand on your own 2 feet. That's not what it's about. It's like, that's one of those things that our culture and our society, that's what we push. We push a lot of independence and autonomy, and we want our kids to grow up and go out there and do something and be somebody and whatever else, right? That's not at all what these ancient, Eastern or Near East cultures were living. That's not what they were experiencing. In fact, most of the time, the families lived together, like the whole family. Or at the very least, you all lived in the same town, like real close by. And yeah. Because that's what I was going to say. Yeah, because most of Bishop's sons are like 30 years old, right, or older, and before they're leaving out. And some of them still haven't left home, or well, they at least haven't left the ministry. They're still there. They're still working with their father. Speaking of the church in Nigeria that we've connected with. But anyways, so that whole idea of go out there and be strong and be independent and be autonomous or whatever, it's not at all what, at least in my mind and in my opinion, it's not at all what God had in mind. Whether that's from the standpoint of just a society, or we're just talking about the family of God. Like, I don't think that that's what God had in mind. Because the other thing is, it does perpetuate a lot of what we would call nowadays mental illness. So things like depression and anxiety and all those things can be stemmed from somebody trying to go out here and make something of themselves, or trying to work and do their own thing and be their own man. That's the big thing with boys anyways, or young men. Be their own man and be strong and all those kinds of things. Well, if they're failing at that in any regard, then, and especially if they don't have a lot of support from their family, or they don't feel like if they went back home and said, hey, I've messed up, or I'm not really succeeding, or I'm not doing this right, or whatever it is that they may come back with, if they feel like they're going to be shamed because of that, or if they feel like they're going to be rejected because of that, then it's not going to do anything but drive those emotions and those thoughts even deeper. It's going to cause those to grow, and that's another reason that we see suicide rates climbing, especially among young men. It's not as predominant among women or young ladies, because most of the time when we're raising girls, we encourage them to express themselves, or we encourage them, or we're more apt to listen, right? With boys, we're especially more apt to, if they fall down and scrape their knee, I'll get up and brush it off, quit your crying or whatever, right? We don't typically do that with girls. We're usually, especially dads with girls, we're going to come to the rescue, right? We're going to snatch them up, it's okay, baby, it's that and the other, whatever. Let them cry, do their thing. And so we've created, as a society and as a culture, we've created this environment where young men, they don't feel like they can do the same thing that maybe their sister or their cousin who's a girl or whatever can do, where if they go out there and fall flat on their face, they can come running back home and everything will be okay, right? And so again, that's caused suicide rates, especially among men in the West, or boys in the West, especially ages 18 to 25, to skyrocket. So anyways, I say all that to say that the juxtaposition between David and Goliath is very clear there in the story, that we've got this one man who has built himself up. He's arrayed in a garment that is, in all this armor and stuff that's made with man's hands. It's been constructed by men. And then you have this little boy who's standing out there in his shepherd's garments, right? And it's just this beautiful picture of what I would say is the acceptable of God, which would be David, who's the beloved, and then the things that God really doesn't want to have anything to do with, right? And even when David was going to go out and face him, when Saul kind of like comes to the terms with it or whatever, or accepts the fact that, okay, well, this kid's not going to shut up until he gets to go out here and face this giant, when he tries to put the armor on him, he says, no, I can't do that. He puts the armor on. He's like, no, this doesn't fit. This doesn't work. And I'm thinking about what you're saying, that as we pile these things on, we actually build out the limitations. We build out the limitations of the individual. And, we do that with religion. We do that with, within our families or whatever, with our own personal opinions and whatever else, right? We build out these limitations, whether it's on our own children or the things that we've put on ourselves or we've allowed others to put on us. Or we do the same thing with folks who come into our church or come into our religious community, whatever it may be. And we want to build out the limitations on those people based on the limitations we've put on ourselves or other people have put on us. Because a lot of times, I know we've said this over and over, but a lot of times people, they don't actually know what they believe. They believe a lot of the things that, or they say they believe a lot of the things that they believe because somebody else told them. Somebody else said that this is what you should believe. Or this is how God is, or this is what God looks like, or this is what it looks like to have a relationship with God, or this is what it looks like to live a righteous life, quote unquote. And it's just building out those limitations for the individual. And we totally limit the potential, the creative potential, all of it. We limit the person, the individual, and we put them in this box. Just like we put God in a box, like you said, we want to bookend God with Genesis and Revelation and be done with it, and say that that's it. And it's like, no, it's so much bigger than that. And it's the same thing with the imagination or the ideas or the potential that a child possesses. And that's what David shows, that there's so much more potential in the things that he's experienced with his father and that he's learned from God, and the times that he's been able to spend out in the field and spend with the sheep. It's God preparing him to shepherd an entire nation of people, right? Those are the things that God was preparing him for. And then Goliath's just another learning experience. And he passes the test. He passes it with flying colors because he's not going to do it man's way. He's going to go about it the way that God showed him how to do it. And so you have this, again, Goliath, right? And eventually we get to the point where, David, and actually Pastor said something Sunday that I thought was really great. He says David is ready to go. He's raring and ready to go to battle. He's like, he asks the question, is there not a cause among us? What are we doing? Seriously? You guys are out here shaking in your boots at this person who is absolutely not going to win. There's no way this guy can win because he's not on our side. He's not serving our God, and so he steps up and he says, hey, we got to go. Let's get out here. Let's fight this guy. Let's face this guy, which I thought was really beautiful too, because that's just like a child to do, right? Let's rush into things. Let's, because when kids are excited, it's like Harmony. If you tell her we're going to go do something, or we're going somewhere, or, we're going to play a game, on Thursday night or whatever. We're going to have family game night on Thursday night or whatever. Like, she's like, okay, let's go play the game. Yeah. Because it's like, in her mind, in that context, I only know how to do this right now. You know what I mean? Like, let's go. And that's exactly what David rolled in with. So he goes into battle, takes down Goliath, even against all the mockery, all of the things that Goliath represents as one who is totally opposed to the things of God or the ways of God, and takes him down, chops his head off. And I tried to draw the picture of, he's arrayed in this bronze armor, and the breastplate is like little shekels of bronze, and so it looks like scales. And then the helmet and everything, it's all made out of bronze. And bronze represents judgment in Scripture. And so, here's this one hurling accusations, judging against Israel in the most negative light. And then you got David, who takes him down. He actually, theoretically, I guess, hits him in the knee. not in the forehead, but actually hits him in the knee and causes Goliath to fall forward, and he's wriggling around like a snake. And he goes up and he chops his head off. And this all connects back to Genesis chapter 3, where God tells the serpent that you're going to slither around on your belly for the rest of your life, or whatever, for the rest of eternity. You're gonna slither around on your belly, and you're gonna eat the dust of the earth. And so it's like this picture of the serpent Goliath, who's been taken down. He's it's a prophetic picture, right? And it's a prophetic picture of something that's going to happen down the road. And so he chops his head off, and he takes the head back and the sword as trophies. And Pastor actually got us some good information. So the head and the sword were lost, and they're recovered. So David actually recovers the sword when he's running from Saul, who's trying to kill him and his men, right? And he goes to Nob, and he's there, and the priest Ahimelech actually gives David and his men the showbread, right? The old showbread. And he says that David didn't have a sword, he didn't have a weapon. He says, we actually have the artifact or the trophy from your victory with Goliath. It's here in Nob, take it, right? And so he recovers the sword. Now, and then after Saul's death, he recovers the skull. And that's when he takes it and he buries it outside the city. And that is the place that it becomes known as the place of the skull. Now, it's called Goliath, right? So Goliath's name is actually Goliath, and it becomes known as Goliath. Now, once we get to the New Testament, then we understand that place is called Golgotha, okay? So it's the same place. So David buries the skull in the place where Jesus is going to be crucified. Now, ultimately, Jesus is crucified, and the prophecy from Genesis chapter 3 comes true, right? That there's going to be an enmity between the child of Eve, or the child of the woman, and the serpent. And that enmity is seen when we look at the story of David and Goliath. We see that here's this one who's the child, that's David, right? And then we have the serpent, Goliath. And then we have one who comes after the lineage of David, and that's Jesus, right? He's born after that same lineage. Yeah. And then we have the skull of Goliath that's buried in Golgotha. And the idea is that Jesus is there. He's crucified on the cross. They send a nail through his feet or through his heel. And that's where his heel is bruised by the serpent, and yet he bruises the serpent's head, or crushes the serpent's head by defeating death on that day. Because he dies, he's buried, and then he raises again. And then the serpent is overcome. And it's that same serpent that we talk about in the book of Revelation, that old serpent, the great red dragon, the accuser of the brethren, right? That's the one, that's cast down. That's the one, that's Goliath. That's exactly what happened. Again, a picture of what is to come, and Christ accomplishes that. Why? So that we can know that we have accomplished that. It doesn't matter what accusing voice is hurling accusations at you today. And it could be a voice within yourself. I mean, I don't know how many times I'm the one that's putting me down. It's not even so much other people. It's more so myself. I'm putting me down. The giant that I'm facing is the voice, is my own voice, is my own disqualification of myself for whatever reason. Whether it's shame, or feeling like you haven't measured up, or feeling like you haven't done enough, or whatever. And again, some of that's perpetuated by our society and by our culture, especially among young men. And so I have to remind myself, no, that's not what God says about me. That's not what God says, that I'm beloved, and that's it. That one greater than David has come. One more beloved than David has come, and that was Christ. And if I'm in Christ, then I'm more beloved than David. So I'm the more beloved now. And that's the only way that I can view myself. That's the only thing that I can say about myself. That's the Philippians 2 in the mirror. I mean, it's so concise. It's just to the point, right? That the only valid way to view yourself is the way that Jesus viewed himself. And that was as nothing more than beloved. Behold, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. I mean, AJ sent that earlier today. That's exactly what God had to say about Jesus. That's exactly what he has to say about you. Every one of us. And then the other thing that I thought was really beautiful was Goliath is from a place called Gath. And Gath means wine press. And in Revelation 19, John said that he's talking about the description of Jesus. And he says he's got a vesture that's been dipped in blood, and he's got a name that's written on his thigh. And he says that he's tread the winepress of God's wrath. He's already taken care of whatever judgment or whatever anger or hatred you think that there is, that is supposed to be coming from God. That's something that growing up, that's all I ever really heard. And I had a conversation with a young man last night actually, and we were talking back and forth about kind of where we came from, and I told him, I said, that's the experience that I had in church, and I'm sure that his was not unlike that, and he agreed with that. And that God's mad at you for some reason, or that you're inherently evil, or that you're inherently wrong, or that you're constantly doing something that disqualifies you from God's love. It's like, no, not at all. That's not at all the gospel. That's not at all what Jesus has shown us. And that's not at all, when we look at that revelation in Revelation 19, he's already tread the winepress of all of that. Not that God ever had anything against you, but it's all the judgment that we had against ourselves. That accusing or that serpentine voice, because it's the same voice that was in the garden that said we weren't good enough in so many words, right? You're not like God. You need to eat this fruit so that you can be like God. And it's like, no, I'm already of God. He already breathed his life into me. And so we are of God, little children. Yeah.
That verse in Revelation 19, the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of the Almighty.
Yeah.
The word fierceness means passion.
Mm-hmm.
So again, with your beloved, and wrath means desire. So he's already gotten into his own desire, our desire, and his passion is already, his passion for us is showing on him visibly. There's no way to deny it.
And that's it. Yeah, there's no denying it. That's good. Because it's the same thing with winemakers back then. And when they tread the grapes, right, their feet would be dyed red, or the color of the grapes. And so there was no denying that you're a winemaker, because that's not coming off your skin. Like you permanently, dyed or whatever, as long as you're pressing grapes. And so that's exactly right. I mean, it's undeniable that Christ's passion, his desire, and I have seen that. Yeah, the wrath of God, and I've read that multiple times, that the translation is not so much like the wrath of God that he has towards sinners. And I think it's Ephesians 5 or 6, where it says that Paul says that the wrath of God is towards those who are living in darkness. And but anyways, I think it's Ephesians 5. But he says that the wrath of God is towards those, or on those who are living such a lifestyle. And when I looked up that word, that's what it means. His desire. And it actually means a stretching forth or a reaching forth, as if to reach your hand out to someone in assistance. And so it's, the thing that God has towards sinners, quote unquote, is desire. That's it. All he wants is to be connected to you. He's just reaching out his open hand so that you'll take it. That's all he wants. He just wants to be connected to you. So, what you got?
Yeah, Josh threw me a curveball here. Thought he was going to go ahead of me, but I can go ahead and go. One of the beautiful places that I think you dipped into Sunday was where you left it. You went into Romans and you talked about the renewing of the mind. So we are transformed or metamorphosed by the renewing of our mind. And that renewing is the word renovation. So we're transformed by the renovation of our mind, and my mind always goes to these HGTV shows where they go in and they find these houses that they want to renovate. But some of the most amazing scenes in those shows is when they go to pull up the shag carpet from the 70s or whatever it may be that they've covered over these beautiful hardwood floors. So that's essentially what we're doing. As we dive back into the origin of who we are, as we go back out into the deep of who we are, as we chase our shadow into these places, as Josh will get into Sunday, as we how does Pastor say it? Incorporate our darkness. What's the word? Integrate our darkness as we absorb our shadow. We're starting to uncover the fact that there's beautiful hardwood floors. Then we've covered and you know what a picture that they would put shag carpet over hardwood floors just because it was the thing to do. It was cool. Yeah, I mean, it was cool to have shag carpet. But then you go in there now and you tear this carpet up and you're like, why in the world would you have covered over these hardwoods? And we're transformed by the renovation, by the renewing of our mind. We're metamorphosed by that. So go to Jeremiah 17, and I just want to make a couple tie-ins here because this keeps coming up in this childlike message. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. And this is beautiful in the backdrop of David's story. Thus saith the Lord, cursed be the man. That word man there is geber, which means a valiant man or warrior. Thus saith the Lord, cursed be the warrior that trusteth in man. That word for man is Adam, which is, of course, Adam. Thus saith the Lord, cursed be the warrior that trusteth in Adam, and maketh flesh his arm, and whose heart departeth from the Lord. For he shall be like the heath, or better word would be a shrub or a tumbleweed even, in the desert, and shall not see when good cometh, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land, and not inhabited. Because when you're trusting in anthropos, when you're trusting in the strength, when you have made flesh your arm, when you've made manhood your victory, your go-to, yep. I'm going to earn it by the sweat of my brow. Yep. And you're just like that tumbleweed that's in the desert, that's in the salt land that can't live. It's not going to, the only thing that is promised is death. The only thing you're promised is death when you dip into this anthropos mindset. So it's a picture of where we are now as a society, where we are now as a people. I mean, we could look at the current times and say, oh my goodness, things are so terrible. I had that conversation with a man today, and I was so ready to get out of that conversation because he was like, man, our taxes are going to be so bad this year, and oh man, our tax returns are going to be, and I'm just like, man, but we're kids. We're children. It's okay. We're going to make it, you know. But that's that picture of that tumbleweed in the salt land that can't be inhabited. When you trust in anthropos, the only thing you got promised is death. Death and tax. What are the three things? Death and tax. Or just two things. Death and taxes. That was my first day on the job. That's what I learned. This guy told me. He came up to me and said, you working hard or hardly working? And then he said, there's only two things you get in life, promise, death and taxes. Yeah. And so, yeah, that was probably my first day on the job. But anyway, verse 7, blessed is the man, the warrior that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. For he shall be like a tree, as a tree. And this is where Michael just beautifully lost it Sunday. And it was probably my favorite Michael moment. It was just so beautiful to watch because I could just see that you could really care less who was watching you in that moment. There was no anthropos at all about it. You were just so lost in this truth of who you are. And it's so beautiful. I've thought about it all week. But you talked about, and you really came undone when you talked about the picture of our thoughts looking like a tree. The image of our brains, of our brain having a thought, is the tree, the limbs of a tree. And then here you have this beautiful imagery where it's this tree that's planted by the waters. What waters? The waters of reflection. My soul remembers who I am by the waters of reflection. And here goes, and that spreadeth out her roots by the river, and shall not see when heat cometh. Now remember, the shrub couldn't see when good comes. Now, if you're planted by the rivers of reflection, you're not going to know when heat comes. You're not even going to be affected by the drought. Man, but her leaf shall be green, evergreen, and shall not be careful in the year of drought, neither shall cease from yielding fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins. I try the mind, even to give every ish. That word for man there is ish, which means a male human being, a man, anthropos. According to what? His ways. Because this dude's made what? His arm. Flesh, his arm. He's given him according to the fruit of his doings. And then it goes into this picture here. As the partridge sitteth on the eggs, and hatcheth them not, so is he that getteth riches, and not by right. He shall leave them in the midst of his days, and at his end shall be a fool. But verse 12 is where all the money is made in the kingdom, okay? I said that in an anthropos way. But it is where the glory is. Verse 12, a glorious high throne from when? From the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. As David, as walking up to Goliath, Goliath. I'm having a hard time. I'm learning. Goliath, as David is walking up to Goliath, Goliath is the picture of the man that made flesh his arm. That is a tumbleweed in the desert. That looks at this moment like, man, this is just the thing to be. Goliath. I just want to be him. It's almost like putting shag carpet over hardwood floors. It's just so in right now. Let's just put this shag carpet down. But David's the one that comes up and he's like, man, there's hardwoods in my spirit. Yes. There is an identity in me. I am planted by the rivers. And David writes that. Yeah. He wrote Psalm 23. Yep. He's the one that's led by the still waters. He's the one that his soul does remember who he is. And he walks up to Goliath because he's living in the high throne that he's been in from the beginning, the sanctuary. And he walks up to this picture of anthropos and he takes a slingshot, which is so kid-like. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I remember having my slingshot, man. You couldn't find me anywhere. I remember my dad making me one. And he had my name. He took like an ice pick and he like dotted AJ on it. And I can remember that in my mind right now. And he would give me marbles all the time. And then I remember going up to my grandma's because my grandma would always till a garden. Or my dad, as she got up in age, my dad would till the garden. But I remember, oh man, this is happening right now. So you'll have to forgive me. But as they would till that garden every year, I would go up there and look where that tiller had went and plowed up the earth, and I would find my dad's marbles from the 50s. And I used to love to go up to my grandma's garden and look for the marbles. And I'm just now thinking about this. I probably haven't thought about this in 20 years. But I remember going where they would till that garden every year, and I would find these marbles that my dad played with when he was a kid in the 50s. And it was something that I would go home and I would show him the marbles that he had when he was a kid. And it's this picture of David walking up to Anthropos saying, you don't know who you are, but I know exactly who I am. Man. That's why the rock landed. Yeah. That's why it landed. And he's got those smooth stones by the waters of reflection as well. Yeah. But one other point, and I'll hand this over to Josh. Then this is something that everybody knows, but we just have to say it. David had already been anointed. Yeah. David had already been anointed when he went to fight Goliath. So the picture of it in our life is we're already anointed. We're already a glorious high throne from the beginning. What can you not face? What can you not face? Because if you don't make flesh your arm, if you don't make flesh your arm, and you trust in the Lord, if you make the Lord your hope, whose hope is in the Lord, whose hope the Lord is, if that's your hope, then you can face any giant in your life. I'll go ahead and hand it off there.
David came with power. David was made competent by his anointing and by his relationship with God. David was made competent when he was in the fields with the sheep, and he fought the bear and he fought the lion. God had already shown him how to overcome. And God had already showed him that despite his number of years on this earth, despite his stature, despite his position in his own family, that he could overcome anything that he faced. And when you went through this Sunday, I was just, one, to listen to anyone preach a message and tie it together from Genesis to Revelation, they've got something that's really cooking there. That's really, really on the money. And then when we talk about the symbolism of the garden and the accuser and the serpent-like way of deception, and that deception, as we've been discussing, is the deception of who you really are. Remember, with the way Francois words it, it's the fruit of the I am not tree. Because they were already everything they needed to be in that place, in that position, and in that moment. When the accuser visits, when that accusation is hurled down, it's, well, you'll be like God, but you already are God. So it's a deception the whole time. It's not an understanding that this accuser has over the information that we don't possess. In other words, like the church is telling you, well, you have to be saved. You got to come find all this out. We've got all this good stuff waiting for you. If you'll just follow our rules, you'll follow our regulations, you'll do what we say do, you'll come to church on this time, at that time, you'll stand up, you'll sit down, you'll preach this, you'll say that, you'll pray this, you'll pray that, and you'll mind your P's and Q's out in public, then you can have all of this. And the reality is, the truth is, you already possess it. We go back to Kings, and we talk about Solomon. When Solomon prays for wisdom, after living 3.5 years under the mantle of a man, he prays for wisdom. And God doesn't say, well, I will give you what you ask. I've already given you what you've asked. That's already inside you, Solomon. That's why you're making this prayer, because you've come to the understanding that the mantle of a man is not what makes you king. And when Solomon begins his prayer, he says, my father David was the king, but you have made your servant king. And when we talk about that, then we're getting into an understanding of what David was doing when he was fighting Goliath. If not being a servant to the entire nation of Israel, if not being the one person willing to voluntarily sacrifice everything for God, for countrymen, he did everything that none of the men were willing to do. They're all standing back, wondering how they're going to fight this massive giant. And that is the struggle that we all face. When we begin to look within, and the working out of salvation comes with fear and trembling. When we look within, there's giants in there. Oh, and there's deceptions in there. There's ideas about myself that are in there that I have to contend with, and I don't know, as a man, if I can overcome those deceptions. But as a child, what are we standing around waiting for? What possibly could stand against the power that God has given me? Not the power that's accumulated by man, by works, by anthropos, that becomes tyranny and creates the hierarchies that corrupt the entire system, but it's the sufficiency of relying on God. So we have these three men, and as we're going through this, obviously you talked, Michael, about the attack on men and on boys, and that is something culturally that we have to address from real truth and real understanding that
yes.
men are just as important as the women, and for God's sake, the women are just as important as the men.
Yes.
We get bogged down in the writings of men who had an agenda to skew things one direction for one half of our species.
Right.
That day is over.
Yes.
When we talk about sons, I mean sons and daughters. We have to read the text that we're given, but this is the explanation. When we talk about childlike faith and sonship, that is children. That is all of us, both male and female. And in the beginning, as you appropriately pointed out, both male and female made he him. So that was coexisting in the same being. Now, God, who creates limitation so that he's not alone, and he gives space for his creation to live and manifest and find him, creates Adam in his image, and he realizes immediately, oops, if Adam is both male and female in one being, he's just as alone as I am. And he won't come search for me. He'll be self-sufficient. He won't come search for me. I'm the self-sufficient one. I'm the whole of what is masculine and what is feminine. I exist in both of those domains of creation, imagination, and thought and logos. But I need to separate the male from the female. Why? Well, because they're going to long for a relationship to be unified. And in that longing for a relationship to be unified and become one, they're going to realize there's something else to become one with. And a threefold cord is not easily broken. So when you started preaching this message Sunday, I'd been watching Hook, and I've watched it too many times at this point. But I'm trying to be prepared because we have an important day Sunday. We have one of our sons in the natural world who is coming to lay down the very ideas of manhood that will rob him of his identity so that he can be raised as a child of God and become the child king of promise. That's quite a big stage to set up and set the table for. And I hope that I'm able to do that. But there was something in the movie, and I'll give a little bit about Sunday. I don't want to give away all the good stuff. But there was something that struck out to me when I was watching it this past time this week. And when you preached Sunday, it brought me back to this thought process is we do get wrapped up and caught up in Abba, father, and son relationship. But where are the mothers in these stories? What are the women doing in these stories? When you talk about David, David's mother's not really mentioned in the Bible all that often. About two places. One of the places, though, is attributed to Psalm 86:16, and I'll read that. It says, "O turn unto me and have mercy upon me," praying to God. "Give thy strength unto thy servant." So David identifies himself as a servant when he's talking to God. He doesn't identify himself as king. He doesn't identify himself as the man David. He identifies himself as a servant, which is something his son learns from him. And when he prays to God himself, he comes to God in the form of a servant. And that gets much more significant when we talk about what Jesus does and how he sets the table for us. Give thy strength unto thy servant. Now, servant here comes from the word ebed, which means servant in the form, as form of, an address between equals. So when David comes to God as a servant, he's coming to God as a servant that's an equal servant with the servant to him. He's praying to God because God is being a servant to him, but he's praying to God as a servant because he's being a servant to God. There's reciprocity in this relationship with the beloved. And save the son, which comes from the word ben, which is the son as the builder of the household name or the family name, the natural. So save the natural man, save the natural son of thine handmaid. Now, thine handmaid refers to his mother here. And when I looked that up, it's very close to Abba. It's Amma. And it means the maidservant of humility. Now, when I looked that up, C.S. Lewis came to mind. And how do we bear the weight of our neighbor's glory? It's only through humility. Who is the natural being that exists in our lives that gives us that understanding of the world? To humble ourselves and go and talk to Dad. Or before we even talk to Dad,
who goes to dad and talks to dad for us? So then I started thinking about, well, we talked about Solomon. Where was Solomon's mom in this?
Right.
Well, we know where Solomon's mom was. When Adonijah makes his play for the crown, Bathsheba, being the handmaid, being Amma, the maidservant of humility, humbles herself, talks to Nathan, and then she goes and talks to her husband and says, don't you remember telling me that God had made you king? And who was going to sit on your throne would be your son Solomon? And now Adonijah. Now Adonijah is taking over, and he's ruling things.
Right.
And Nathan plays it smart.
Yeah.
Nathan says, Bathsheba, you go in there first.
Yep.
Because if he's going to say yes to anybody, it's going to be you.
That's right.
This man's already killed for you. We know who you are.
Right.
We know who you are.
Right.
In the context of the story, you're the one.
Yeah.
You're it.
Yeah.
He was willing to throw it all away for you. So you go in first. And then before you get done speaking, I'm going to come in and back you up.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what Nathan does. He comes in and backs up the mother's play, who comes in humility to ensure that her child, her son, her baby becomes king as a child. Not as his older brother who stepped into the role of manhood, but as a child king. So that's who she's petitioning for. Well, then I say, okay, well, he goes all the way to Jesus. So what's Mary doing in this story? And this is where I had a conversation with AJ, and this is where the Catholic faith really starts to get things right. Now, shortly after this, I think they go awry in several directions. But that's true of all religions.
Come on.
So when I say that, there are problems with Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen, Jainism, Christianity, Catholicism. All organized religions in the form of their institutions have the fingerprints of man all over them, and it skews the promise.
Right.
It's another way that man puts on the mantle of the accuser and begins to deceive the people of God into not believing they are already everything God designed them to be. There's nothing wrong with your design. There's nothing wrong with who you are. There's nothing wrong with being childlike, because it's the childlike that overcomes the manlike nature, the human nature, the limitation that we're placed in. So I had read in Luke 1 a couple of weeks back. So I went back there, and I've cherry-picked a couple of scriptures so I don't put us all through that whole chapter again. But in verse 32, obviously this chapter deals with Elizabeth, whose womb was barren, who was given a child that becomes John the Baptist, who would be the foreteller of Jesus' coming. Her cousin is Mary. Mary gets word from Gabriel she's going to receive a son. He says, your cousin Elizabeth is about 6 months along. You should go and talk with her. Mary goes. But this is what's said in verse 32. The eminence of his stature, talking about the baby, the child king that Mary is to be carrying, will be magnificent. He will be known as the Son of the Most High. So it's significant there to me that that's how it's said. He'll be known as the Son. So he won't be known as the Most High, but the Son of the Most High. He will always forever be attached to his position in the family as a son, as a child king. And the Lord God will return to him what already belongs to him, the throne of his father David. Return there from didomai, which means to give someone what already belongs to them. And this is what we're saying. All things already belong to you.
Right.
It's being returned to you when you slough off the manhood, when you overcome the accusation, when you bruise the head of the serpent and crush it with your heel, when you cut off the head of the serpent that is the accusing man in front of you and lay him to rest. Verse 33, and he will reign as king over the house of Jacob, and his kingdom will be without any boundaries. Verse 37, then Gabriel quotes Genesis 18:14, and this is from the Septuagint. It says, every word of God is equal to God's power. So the Logos of God is equal to God's power, and the purpose to perform that word. Now, we've talked about Jeremiah, but Jeremiah has a vision. And he tells God, in my vision, I see an almond branch budding.
Yeah.
And God says, you have seen well, because I am, and this is the word for almond, awake over my word to perform it.
Right.
So what do we know about Solomon? What do we know about David? Is that the Logos that embodied those structures, God was awake to perform those words and bring about the very Messiah, the very incarnation we all needed. So Jeremiah was definitely hitting the nail on the head there. Verse 48. I'm so aware, and this is Mary, this is where it got me. Because we have two instances where with David, he's acknowledging that his mother is a woman of humility, which humbles him in his prayer. Bathsheba humbles herself, goes before the king, petitions for Solomon's kingship as the child king, and is granted that. We think about Hagar and her prayer where God proves to be Jireh and he sees Ishmael, and Ishmael is restored to the son of promise he should be by the time Abraham dies. We get that wrong in the New Testament, but we're here to get it right today. So Mary goes to Elizabeth, and she's talking to Elizabeth, and this is where we know what we're talking about has to represent what is true. She says, I'm so aware of God's favorable gaze upon my life. Even though I'm a handmaid of no prominent social standing, I'm just a woman from humble beginnings. I don't have anything of prominence. I don't have great wealth. I don't have a great master's house that I live in, that I take care of, that I clean. I have no prominent social standing. I'm here in full and complete humility for what God has asked me to do, which is bear a child. Bring a child into the world. And this is the value of women. This is what separates them from everything else. They possess the very innate ability to form, create, and give birth to the next idea of God. And if we discount that for someone who holds a mic or who sings a song or who runs a building or who runs a foundation, and we don't understand that the reason why our culture is lashing out at men is because we haven't given the proper space and the proper prominence to these women of humility who have to humble themselves to even have a child in the first place, because it wrecks their body. It puts them through something that changes them forever. They have to humble themselves for that moment. The gravity and weight is significant. So she says, even though I'm a handmaid of no prominent social standing, I'm just a humble servant. From now on, God's favor will be endorsed in every birth, and his blessing will be evident for all generations to realize. We have a Father, and when we see our Father, we see our reflection. We remember who we are. But before we get there, when I was watching the movie Hook, as I was watching it, Peter was trying to remember his happy thought. And I know it sounds silly to talk about this, but if you're into silly, tune in Sunday, because it's going to be a whole message of it. As he's in the treehouse with Tink, and he's rummaging about where him and Wendy and Toodles and John all used to play and sleep when they were there in Neverland. He begins to try to think back on those moments and those times, and he begins to remember. And he remembers where they would sit up, and where Wendy would sit and read the books from, and where they would sit when she read, and who slept where. And he goes over to where he would sleep, and he finds a teddy bear. When he finds the teddy bear, the first thing he remembers is not his father, but it's his mother. And the statement is his mother used to put this in the pram so he wouldn't be alone. And he kept it. Now, as he's holding the teddy bear and remembering his mother and remembering the beginning of his life, as crazy of a thought as that is to have, to remember back that far,
Right.
to have that thought. But this is where God gets involved in the storytelling. Oh, you can remember back that far. In fact, I'm going to have you remember much further back than that, before you were ever even thought about being conceived, before your mother and father were even born, before their generations even began. I'm going to bring you back to remembering that far back. But he remembers his mother, and he's talking about Teddy. And he begins to repeat Teddy, and the happy thoughts start working, and Teddy slowly turns into Tatty, and then Daddy. And when he remembers Daddy, he remembers Maggie. He remembers his son. He remembers his children. And he's flying. Yeah. He's floating. He's there. But it starts with mom. So what is this position that mothers are given in this storyline of the childlike, in this reflective water where you see your father and you see yourself? How does a mother play a role? Because mothers bring us into this experience. That's where it all begins. Mom starts our life here. She is the origin source of our existence in this world. It's our very focal point to the very beginning of our lives. And that focal point turns us to our Father to see the very beginning of our being. So it's just as important to have a mom as it is a dad. It's just as important to remember your mom in the days of your youth and who she was to you and what she did for you and how she nurtured for you and how she cared for you and how she fought for you. Because in remembering that and going back to that place, you can find your innocence again. And when you find that childlike innocence, the only thing left to do is to look into that precious stone in Proverbs 17:1-8. That precious stone that's a gift with which to build your artesian well, a fountain that becomes the very eye of your landscape. You reconceive the world. You renovate your entire landscape. It becomes something brand new, built with this precious stone that was only set in motion because you had a mother to bring you here. You had a mother to deliver you here. You had a mother to teach you the language, because it's that language that the Father's going to speak to you in. And who teaches the young children their language more than anyone in the home? It's mom. Who goes through the flashcards, through the A's, the B's, the C's, and the D's, and whatever else remains? My mom did a good job. I'm just kidding. But you see that precious stone, and you become the master of your dreams. You become the very Peter Pan of Neverland. And now it's your job to use those lost boys to reveal to all the other lost boys out there who they need to be. Because the lost boys aren't really lost. And I'm not going to go into that any further, but I'll finish this sentence. Now, once you become the master of dreams, you become the leader of the lost boys whose whole purpose is to seek and save the lost boys in men and women, whithersoever this stone is turned, and reveals what you are designed to see in it, which is you. It makes you act circumspectly and therefore unveils the wisdom and intellect born in you. Because it's already there. You can pray for it. And his answer will be, I've already done it. I've already done it. The reason why you're asking for it, the reason why you're humbling yourself is because you had a mom. And how many times, and I have to say this just from a professional standpoint, in the criminal justice system and beyond, we discount so often with the statistics. Single mothered homes and those outcomes. And the statistics are staggering. Fathers need to be in homes. They need to be involved. You need both your parents. But the sheer amount of praying mothers and grandmothers out there reveals to us the very humility we need to tap into the very source of our being that overcomes the man that overcomes the anthropos, that overcomes the patriarchy, which is the corruption of manhood to power.
That's right.
For true fatherhood.
Yeah.
And the true fatherhood plays with the children, rescues the children, guides the children, leads the children, and lets the children lead him. The man chooses the leader in the end of the movie, and the leader is a child. The king is a child. And all of the kings that we see, whether we're talking about Solomon, whether we're talking about David, whether we're talking about Jesus, they had this unique quality of understanding that as a servant, as a child, getting into the childlike faith was getting into the very heart of the matter with God. And that's where our heart is. That's where his heart is. And that's where we're going. I can't wait for Sunday. I'm going to shut up.
So I want to hit here just a point that we were probably a little immature on earlier in the message, but it's very important that Michael says what he wanted to say with us now in light of what Josh has went into.
Yeah,
so go back into that. And then I've got something to say as soon as you get done with that.
The name David obviously means beloved, so we explained that, but the extension of that is passion. And the ancient Hebrew word or symbols or whatever translates into this picture, and it's like I said, it's a straight line and it's got like a little square underneath it, and it looks like the door to something. And one of those represents the temple door, but two of them side by side represents the two danglers or the breasts of a woman. Now, there's an interesting piece to that, and this ties into what Josh had to say. You want to say?
No, go.
Okay, so the two danglers, the breasts, the udder, like on a cow or whatever, but it also is connected to the masculine, like dad.
Yeah.
Okay, so the bosom of the father. So like the same with the breast of the father. So not only would the mother hold the child to their breast, but the father would hold their child to the breast. And like Josh said, God is the combination of both the masculine and the feminine. Right. He is the fullness of masculinity or not masculinity. He's the fullness of the masculine and the feminine, okay? Right. And the Spirit of God is the one that nurtures us. Right. And so, and you said, like you said, the mother usually teaches the language. Well, right. what happens on the day of Pentecost, right?
Mother tongue.
Okay, so the mother tongue comes, and the Spirit of God, the mother part of God, is teaching the children the language to speak. Yeah. Right? The language that unlocks their tongue, gives them knowledge that they never even knew that they had. That's why I could hear and I could speak in a language that I've never spoken before. Yeah. And so it's the combination of the two. It's both the father and the mother within God that nurtures us. But that's what that represents, AJ, is the beloved or the passion representing the two breasts that are hanging down.
Okay. So 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 23, and we're going to go into 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 23. So being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible, by the word of God, which liveth and abideth forever. For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of Anthropos as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away. But the word of the Lord endureth forever. And this is the word which by the gospel is preached unto you. Wherefore, laying aside all malice, all guile, all hypocrisies and envies, and all evil speakings, as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that you may grow thereby. If so be that you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. Oh man, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but disallowed indeed of men, right. But chosen of God and precious. Yeah. You also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood,
to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, Behold, I lay in Sion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be ashamed, confounded, put to shame. Unto you therefore which believe he is precious, but unto them which be disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner. Oh man, verse 9, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And we could just keep on going, but you see that it's Peter that writes these words, and it's so in line with what Josh is saying, and it's so in line with the word beloved being that picture of a baby, of your baby. The first thing that hits that baby's stomach is the milk from his mother or her mother that generates that body to begin to grow. So this is the picture of what is happening spiritually as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if so be what? If you've tasted that the Lord is kind.
Yeah.
If you've tasted that he's kind.
Yeah.
And you can just see it just beaming from us, because there is a truth in all of this that we're uncovering, what I believe. And I don't think this is a stretch to say. This is the fountain of youth.
Yeah.
This is the fountain of youth.
It's good.
It's eternity. It's Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. God is young.
Yeah.
God's young.
It's good.
Come on.
It's good.
Come on. Go ahead.
Yeah, I stumbled across this revelation, and I was gonna hold on to it, but I guess I'll go ahead and spill the beans. But I was listening to I was listening to a neuroscientist give a talk the other week, and let me say this before I dive into that, because there's a couple of things on the servant thing. So David says, when he's standing there with the men, he says, let thy servant go before this giant. And then when he goes to Saul, he says, thy servant will go.
Yes.
And so I thought that was absolutely beautiful, because that is the way that he approaches it.
Right.
And like we talked about, one greater than David has come.
Yeah.
A greater David has come, and Jesus dons the servant's towel.
More and more and more and more and more of a servant.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Jesus is the one who says that it is enough for the servant to be as his master.
Yes.
And so it's when you're talking about that prayer that David's praying, it's seeing yourself as equal. Yeah. And it's the same thing as Philippians 2, right? That you should have this mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, that he thought it not robbery to be equal with God.
Right.
Because we're a part of the Father. It's like me denying my son. I cannot deny my son. If you saw the picture on Facebook, the advertisement for Sunday, you can definitely say that I cannot deny my son, right? Like, it's unbelievable. And it's like, well, yeah, duh, he's your son. He should look like you. And it's like, yes, that's the point. Mm-hmm. He does. He looks exactly like me, which means you look exactly like God.
Right.
We look like exactly like God.
Right.
Well, it's what Hadley's poem is.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What she's writing.
Yep.
As a servant who's being humble and trying to understand all of these words and all of these messages, she writes in a way that says, well, God's asking me to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. And if God's asking me to do it, then I can do it.
That's it.
And that's equality.
Yeah.
It doesn't, you don't look at, well, God's up here and I'm down here, so he said I can do it, so I guess that means I can do it. It's like, oh no, God had a conversation, this is how it works.
So good.
I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
And that is childlike faith.
Yeah.
That is the very thing that we have to tap into and see that, if something's going to grow out of these ashes, if beauty is going to come out of it, God's asking me to be the one to plant it.
Right.
So she's already out of the religious concept and mindset of works-based that I have to pray
and fast
Correct.
and study and
Correct.
achieve and accomplish.
It's
And
good.
maybe by then, if I toil and labor and work, God will drop a magic seed into this soil and there'll be some beauty come out of these ashes.
Yep.
Hadley has already understood something that has taken most of us our entire lives as adults
So
to
good.
realize is,
So good.
oh, if this field is full of ash, if this place is full of ashes, I know how to bring beauty out of it. I'm going to go plant a seed. I'm
Yep.
going to do what my father did in the
God,
very
that's good.
beginning when he brooded over the deep and the dark and the abyss, and out of it he brought light. Out of it he brought beauty. And that's what she sees. It's unbelievable that this, I mean, it's not unbelievable. It is believable that
Yes.
these things
Yeah.
are happening,
Yeah.
not just to us, not just in our studying,
Yep.
not just in our understanding, but we're starting to see our children want to get baptized. Our children are writing poems about God that are putting themselves in the position of really having competence in life. Because a child that can look at something that is burned up and destroyed and laid waste to and can see the very godlike potential of, oh, I can grow a garden there.
Yeah.
They might have, it's like Pastor did all those years ago. This might be the county dump.
Yeah.
This
Yep.
might be the corner of the city where they dump all their trash. But I know what I can grow out of there
Yeah.
if I just
Different
plant
eyes.
that seed.
Exactly.
And that is the renovation of the mind, the renewing of the mind, or the opening of the mind's eye,
Yep.
as is often iterated in the Bible and other mythos. That's the eye of Horus. That's what it means to have that vision. Yeah, the third eye is also another example, the
Yep.
chakra.
Yep.
You're seeing things, and Francois would put it this way, right side up for the
Right
first
side up,
time.
yep.
You don't have an upside down view of the world. Now, the world would say, Hadley, that's that's a little crazy. Like,
Yep.
you're not going to be able to, there's science.
Yeah.
There's stuff that goes into this. You just don't, you're young. You just don't understand yet. And Hadley has the wisdom to say, like, well, you might see it that way, but this is the way I see it.
Yeah.
And how dare any one of us correct her vision?
That's exactly right.
Because that is the willful blindness of Osiris.
Right.
There is new vision to be had if
Yes.
you'll have it,
Yep.
if you'll take it, if you'll let the children lead you.
Yep.
You'll walk right into it.
Yeah.
You'll go, if you'll let the children, the 10 spies, the 2 young men that you sent over there that had good report, if you just listened to those 2, they'd have took you right in there.
Yep.
You'd have gotten right in.
Yep.
It's just, I just couldn't help but jump in on that example because that's, God, she's already written down our message for tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
She's ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
And not because she's ahead of the curve in number of age,
No.
but because we're all the same age.
Yep. Yep.
We're all the same.
Yep.
We're all equal.
Eternal.
That's why you have to suffer the little children unto you, because that God in there is as old as you are.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
That God in there has all the wisdom you've been praying and working and toiling
Yeah.
for.
Yep.
That God in there has all of the promises, and all the things of this life will take care of themselves for that God if you just learn how to do what they're doing. And that means the same will be true for you.
Yeah.
Launch back out.
Yeah.
Launch back out into the deep. Cast your nets on the other side. Or
Yeah.
take the time to play in the sand long enough to distract your accusers and save
So
a lost
good.
child
So good.
from destruction
Yeah.
and corruption.
And that's if we're doing our job right, which it seems like we are, if we're doing our job correctly, then our children, first of all, our job is to skirt those things, right?
Yeah.
That people are trying to put on them. But our children will never
The armor.
the armor, right? Yeah, we're trying to keep the armor off of them,
Armor.
right? Trying to keep man's mechanisms off of them.
Very good.
Because they'll never have to experience what we've had to experience. It won't take them 35 or 40 years to figure this thing out, but they're figuring it out when they're 11 and 12 years old, and then they have the rest of eternity to express it. And I was thinking about, talking about planting the seed. Chelsea's been reading this book. It's Hind's Feet on High Places. Okay. So I've never read the book, but she's reading it. And one of the things that she pointed out, she actually told me this after Sunday, and I told her she needed to come up on the panel and teach this or whatever. But So she said the main character's name is Much Afraid. And her cousin's name, who the family wants to force her to marry, is Craven Fear. Okay? And she said the shepherd, so this is obviously God, told her to travel to the high places and she will be given, God, a new name. And her crooked smile will be straight and her lame leg will have strength. But she will face challenges along the way. But once he planted the seed of love, God, once he planted the seed of love, she was no longer afraid. The thought of being made whole surpasses her fear. Happy thoughts. God. I mean, it's ridiculous how much everywhere this is. And you're not lying when you say it is the fountain of youth. Oh, yeah. And David said in Psalm 1 that if you don't walk in the way of men, okay, there's some descriptions there of those kinds of men, but he said if you don't walk in the way of men, you don't sit in the seat of the accuser. Oh, come on now. Yep. Then he said you'll be like a tree that's planted by living waters. Right. The waters of reflection, where we can see our face-to-faceness, our process with God, and we'll be like a tree that the leaf never withers, and we have fruit in every season. Now, I was listening to a neuroscientist that I follow, and he started talking about aging. And he said what they've figured out in neuroscience, and let me say this before I disclose the rest of it, but I talked a little bit about the neuroscience of how the mind can change the brain on Sunday. Good. Because people will tell you things like, you've got a disease, you have an addiction, you have, whatever it is. It's an addiction to drugs, it's alcohol, it's food, it's pornography, it's difficulty with shame or depression, or you have, whatever, you have some kind of mental illness. They want to put a label on you. Those are the same mechanisms that I'm talking about. When we talk about religion, you can jump into psychology or science or biology or the medical field or whatever, and they want to put a label on you. They want to tell you, they want to strap you with something, and they want to put something on you that limits your mobility, that limits your visibility. Because what do they tell you? Well, you've got high blood pressure. Well, what does that do? That limits your vision of the future, does it not? That says, oh my God, well, I might only live to 55. I mean, what if I have a heart attack at 55 because my blood pressure is so high, and then I'm on this medication and it can only do so much. It only limits the high blood pressure to this point, and then beyond that, the medication won't work, and then I'm dead. And what is that? Those things, they limit our visibility of the future. They limit our visibility of the potential that lies within us, the potential that goes beyond what this body can accomplish or what this body can do. That's why Jesus could walk through walls, just appear out of nowhere, because he had already taken off the limitations of this body. He had already shed that. And it's what people want to do, what the world wants to do, what society, culture, and again, even the medical field. And, the thing with psychology, and it's, I'm studying it, right? I'm learning more and more every day. But the thing with psychology is that they want to label you with something, and they want to give you a prescription. The problem is, and there's a gigantic paper that's been released out of the College of London, and you can go look it up. It proves basically over and over that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications do not work. They actually literally do not work. They do not change your symptoms at all. They don't do anything except change the brain chemistry, and you actually become addicted to those pills like you would any other substance. And so, and whatever, you can say what you want to about that, but hey, it's proven in a paper. They thought that for many years. Now it's been proven in a research paper that has been extensively studied and cross-referenced, or not, what do you call it when they look at your work and judge it or whatever, other colleagues. I can't remember what it's called. But anyways, peer review. It's been peer reviewed over and over. And it's been established that those things do not work. Yeah. Because that was not supposed to ever work.
Right.
Those things were not ever designed in God's mind to work. That's a mechanism of man. But I'm listening to this neuroscientist, and we're talking about changing the brain, right? Changing the way that you think about things. God changes our mind. And when we begin to change our brain, our brain influences our body. And it begins to change every single part of us. Literally, your molecular structure will begin to change. Well, the thing that he said was that in science now, they've discovered, or at least this is the theory, right, that aging is an illness. Aging is a sickness. Aging is a disease that can be slowed or reversed. So the thing that I say that because, and we've talked about this before, and you'll hear Pastor Kello say it a lot, that there's a generation that is not going to taste death. There is a generation that's coming, and perhaps it's closer than we think, but there is a generation that is going to be on the face of this planet, and they're going to see the manifestation of Christ in the earth, and they're going to see the dead in Christ rise, and they'll never have to taste of death because they figured out how to stop and or reverse the disease of aging, which leads to death.
Well, so to that point, I had this verse pulled up, so you and I must be listening to the same folks, or we're at least plugged into the right source. Yeah. Psalm 103 verses 4 and 5 says, He redeems your life from the pit or destruction, weaves a crown for him with you. Because we go back to Proverbs 17, and he weaves together the crown out of his children, and that becomes the glory of the Father. So he weaves a crown for him with you out of loving kindness and tender mercies. Who is satisfied your mouth with bountiful things, so your youth is renewed. And that comes from the word chadash, which means repaired, restored, or recovered. So we're just finding out that science is catching up with God's ideas. That's all that means. It doesn't mean that science has figured it out. Science is just unveiling what God has already had for them to see. That's why we have scientists. So God bless all of you in the scientific fields. God bless all of you from every religion and institution that is on this planet. We each have something of purpose to find and give to each other because we all are God's, and we all have a design and purpose to bring forth into this world truth and love, because truth and love are the only ways to mitigate life's pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering attacks the man and makes it difficult to be the child. But truth and love make it easy to be the child. Remember, his yoke is easy, his burden is light. It's younger than your pain. It is younger than your suffering. It predates your manhood and your existence in this limitation. So put that on, and you'll remember the nurturing of your mother, or the nurturing of the pneumas, the spirit of God. You'll see the face of your Father, and you'll be seated as his son once again.
So we're going to finish up, but I got to, this is the bow. This is the bow. Isaiah 11. And this is the prophecy here. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord, and shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove the equity for the meek of the earth, with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with his breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. And the cow and bear shall feed, their young ones shall lie together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Now, when you talk about that verse there in Isaiah, when you're reading that asp and the cockatrice den, those are serpents.
Yeah.
So that ties right into what we're talking about. That prophecy is right exactly what we're talking. That prophecy belongs to the serpent in the garden, to the serpent named Goliath. Is that right? Did I say that right? It is kind of fun to say it that way. Goliath. And what Christ did in going to Golgotha and laying down finally for all time any vestiges of manhood and humanity's hold on the child king. He used the very place where the skull of the man mocking the child, where he would be mocked. His manhood, his status as God would be mocked. His beard would be pulled from his face. Crowns of thorns put on his head. Beaten, bruised, bloodied, and made to carry that cross up that hill. Man, I've taught this, that the real victory was in the garden, and the demonstration was on the mountaintop, was on the place of the skull, was on Golgotha. But the demonstration is much bigger than that. The demonstration is tying in the victory from all time, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, from the first accusation made in the garden to the accusation and mockery made at the nation of Israel that David had to contend with, to the mockery of the very incarnation in the flesh set there to die voluntarily to free himself from his manhood, to slay the beast that is the man. And that's what Jesus goes and he does. He accomplishes what David accomplished, but he accomplished it in himself. It wasn't an external force. It wasn't an externalized deity like we read about in the mythos. The battle that he had to fight was within. He goes to the olive press and is treated more like a wine press, as his sweat is made into great drops of blood. And the bruising doesn't come from the crushing of the grapes to make the wine. It comes from the nail that's driven through his feet to put the final nail in the coffin on manhood. These are the interwoven connections of what Jesus really did, what his ministry was really teaching us. And now we know, without a shadow of a doubt, that's what he's been teaching from the very beginning. Every Old Testament character was being taught this lesson, and they only got so far, and they only got so far, and they only got so far. And you know what? The staff in the desert with the serpents on it only got so far. It only got rid of so much death. It only got rid of so much law. But when he goes up on the cross himself and says, it's not an externalized being, it's not an accuser, it's not the serpent, it's me, myself. It's my manhood, myself, that has to be laid down so that each one of you will know it's your manhood yourself. It's your womanhood yourself that has to be laid down so that your childlike being, the timeless one that inhabits this space, can be resurrected into new life. And the form you take will entirely be up to you. But they will know you because you've been here all along. You've been here from the very beginning. When he appears, we'll be like him. That's what it says. When we appear, we'll be like him. When he appears to him in another form.
Because we'll see him as he is.
Right. I and
That's
the
how
Father are one. When you've seen me, you've seen the Father. When you see my Father, who are you going to see? You're not going to see me. You're going to see you. That's what's going to bring you back to. Now, how do you get back there? Well, you've got to get in touch with this Pentecost moment. You've got to get in touch with this mother language, because Mama's going to bring you back to a childlike state that'll actually let you see what's in that precious stone for you to see.
And that's the job of the church.
Right.
You know, that's why the New Jerusalem, or Jerusalem is our mother.
Right.
And what we've failed to do as the church is teach the children who they really are.
Yeah.
We've failed miserably.
Right.
We've done a horrible job. We've told them they're not good enough. We've
They're
told
the
them
leaders.
they're
Well, we've kept the women out of the job.
absolutely.
In the Christian church, especially, it's all male driven.
Yep.
Even the narrative of the Bible itself is written with a male driven,
Yep.
patriarchal type of style of writing.
Right.
So we've cut our nose off to spite our face.
Yep.
Mom needs to be just as important as dad, or we're getting it wrong.
Yes.
Right.
And we wonder why culture gets it wrong.
Yep.
Right.
And we wonder why we see these staggering rates of fatherlessness in the homes.
Yep.
And then the response to that is toxic femininity, where,
Yes.
well, we don't need a man and we don't need to have kids. We need to have careers and make money. It's all an attack on the children.
Absolutely.
If you don't see that as legislation for killing our children or preventing pregnancy, or however you want to phrase it and word it, whatever side of the political aisle you're on, it's not a political podcast or stream, but when you do that, you're attacking our children. Those are God's ideas.
Yes.
We're cutting that off.
Yes.
That's not what mothers do.
Yeah.
That's not the first decision Solomon makes when he finally gets it right with
Golly.
God is to save the
Mother and
life of a
child.
baby.
So good.
And here we are living in a world where the numbers of deaths of babies are staggering. In the top 5 reasons people die today
Yep.
is just needless murder,
Yep.
death. We go back to these examples and say, well, Solomon was wise, and most everybody will say that. Most scholars will say that.
Yeah.
Even from different religions will say that. But what's the first case he decides? To save a baby's life. Because there was a mother willing to extinguish that life out of convenience and covetousness. And he saw right through it. And he
Yeah.
wasn't looking at the child because the child was innocent.
Yep.
The child didn't need an adjudication. The child didn't need to be vindicated. He was looking at the mothers to see who was going to be a mother and who was going to be caught up in anthropos.
Good. Yeah.
And he found the real one.
So your homework for the end of this week into Sunday is to go look up the movie Hook. I think it was made in the year 1991. It is Robin Williams, Dustin Hoffman. You can get it on HBO Max, I believe, or you can buy it on Amazon, or you could maybe find it at Walmart in one of those huge bins if they still have them of DVDs. So watch Hook, because Josh is going to absolutely blow your mind with everything that's going on in that movie. So I love him
I love him
because he first
because he first
loved me.